I thank the member for Lyons. The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I give the call to the member for Hotham.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'm very pleased to make a contribution today on the Enhancing Online Safety for Children's Bill 2014. Deputy Speaker, it absolutely goes without saying that one of the chief roles for members of parliament in Australia is to protect young people who live in our country. This bill is not perfect, it's not going to solve all of our problems, but it makes an important step towards establishing a safe online community for Australian young people, and for that reason Labor will be supporting the bill. Deputy Speaker, any parent of a school-aged child, or indeed anyone who knows a young person today well, will understand that cyberbullying is one of the most common, the most widespread and the most disturbing trends for young people today. And I say this not because of the consequences, because we know that bullying has always existed, although I must note there have been some very severe consequences, which I'll come to later. But I say it because of the unbelievable prevalence that online bullying has taken on amongst young Australians. The internet for Australian young people is a constant part of life, and the bullying that takes place is an intolerable part of life. I think it's hard for many of us in this chamber to really appreciate how much of a big deal this is for young people in Australia. I'm one of the younger members in this House, but when I was the age of the young people who are most affected by this problem today, I didn't even have an email address, and nor did most people my age in Australia. Photo text messages were a number of years away, Facebook was 10 years away, and Snapchat and Messenger and the other apps that young people use in a day-to-day sense now were a few years beyond that. But now what we see is all of those things, so new to us as Australians, are part of everyday life for most Australian children. As a Member of Parliament, parents very frequently raise the issue of cyberbullying with me, and when I talk to young people who are in this kind of target demographic of around sort of grade 3 or 4 up until year 8 or 9, it's often the first issue that's raised with me when I talk to young people about things that are affecting their quality of life. So I do make those points just to say that there is no doubt that cyberbullying for young people is an issue this parliament should be taking incredibly seriously, and thus I'm pleased to be making these comments on this bill. For those who are watching at home and may not have young children, or even for those in the chamber who aren't aware of the kind of day-to-day significance of this problem, I just want to explain a little bit about the character that I understand cyberbullying is taking on for young people. So we know that young people in Australia are amongst the biggest internet users. Lots of young people I know who are lucky to have a mobile phone will take it to bed with them if they're allowed to, and lie awake at night texting their friends until the early hours. But even for those who are using family computers, the internet is just a part of everyday life. We also know, Deputy Speaker, that it's a very unregulated part of life. And what we see is that bullying that used to take place in the schoolyard has been moved onto this online environment. And because of some of the features of these online programs, some of the barriers that used to stand in the path of bullying have been really stripped back. One of the critical things that we see is young people making fake profiles on Facebook and other types of social media, and using those profiles to avoid what we would normally see as the consequence of bullying that occurred in a schoolyard. We also know that social media has given the opportunity for young people who want to engage in bullying behaviour to say really mean and humiliating and hurtful things in front of hundreds and thousands of people effectively, something that they probably wouldn't be able to do in a face-to-face context. We also know, all of us from our life experience, that sometimes when you're online and using a computer, you say things that you might not say to someone straight to their face, again just because of the consequences. And there are so many other factors. We can keep digital photos now, and people might send them in one context, and then when situations changes, those embarrassing photos are shared with others, even sent to whole school communities, which is something that I'm sure anyone who can remember their time at school would just shudder to think of. One other critical element is the internet has allowed people to speak with each other at any time of the day or night. And when you talk to young people about the effect that cyberbullying has on them, a lot of them just explain that it's taken away a place of safety for them. So they feel that no matter what time of day or night, at the weekend, at any moment, they could be the target of an attack. And Deputy Speaker, that's a very stressful feeling, I know, for a lot of young people who are victims of cyberbullying. I've heard of a lot of young people talk about situations where young people kind of gang up on one young person and sort of go through a bullying and teasing online, again in front of many, many people. And I guess the final thing I would just say is that when we look at the options for young people about what they can do in the face of cyberbullying, there's no silver bullet here. I mean, yes, you can block someone from online, but it's a bit like saying that bullying doesn't matter in a schoolyard context because you can leave the room even when someone might continue to say really humiliating things about you after you leave. The conduct is still occurring and the pain is still occurring even if you're not there to see it. We know that young people can be mean sometimes. Of course, adults can also be mean. But you can just imagine with the sort of impacts that I've described on how the internet has opened up this kind of, very unfortunately, this new world of bullying for young people, that bullying's become a lot easier. Small actions are now capable of creating a lot more pain and hurt. And again, many of those consequences that might have stopped young people from bullying in the schoolyard have now gone. I might just make mention at this point, I do think it's worth noting that there are a lot of studies that show that actually on the whole the internet is quite a constructive thing for young people. So it's important to note that a lot of young people talk about really strong feelings of affirmation they get when they go through a difficult period in their life. A lot of young people will talk about the support they get from online communities. But it does have this darker element, and that's what the bill today that we're discussing is really targeting. So how are young people reacting and being affected by these problems? Well, one of the things that we know, like all bullying, is that cyberbullying tends to leave the victims feeling very depressed, upset. It can go from something like having a few bad days and having low self-esteem, up to points where we know that young people have actually gone to self-harm and to suicide because of online bullying incidents, as sad as that may sound. We hear young people talk about the fact that there's no safe place for them anymore. And so, although this is not a new problem, it's the ease, it's the damage and the ability to escape the consequences. I mentioned earlier about the prevalence of online bullying, and it's very fascinating actually looking at the studies which try to estimate just how prevalent this problem is. So I know there's one study that says that 1 in 5 young Australians has been bullied online. Another study I'm aware of shows something much more significant than that, and that is the Australian Covert Bullying Prevalence Study, which actually found that for young people who are between grade 4 and grade 9, a quarter are bullied every few weeks or more than once a term, which is very common, very prevalent. And I really just come back to this point that I think it's hard for us as adults in this House to realise what a serious and significant problem this is and how much it's affecting young people. We know from some of the studies that it's people around the kind of year 5 and up to year 8 year levels that are most affected by this. And we also know that it is actually, unfortunately, girls that are a little bit more inclined to bully in these covert ways. One of the things that I found most disturbing looking into the material on this is that actually some young people report problems with cyberbullying from as young as grade 3. So we're talking about quite young children here who are getting into these problems. Now, of course, this is very important to young people, and because it's important to young people, it's also important to their parents, Deputy Speaker. We know that children who are the victims of cyberbullying can take those difficulties back into their family home and their unhappiness into their home. And I said at its very worst that bullying can lead into these incidents of self-harm and suicide, which is just incredibly sad. I reflected, just preparing my notes for the discussion earlier, that we see hundreds of young people who are suffering from mental illness and for whom social media plays some role in their ultimate self-harm or suicide. And I just was reflecting on how this is actually a higher figure than the road toll often is from year to year, and just how much emphasis and how much discussion and how many resources go into resolving the road toll. I wonder how many pieces of legislation, both in this parliament and in state parliaments around the country, are focused on this very important issue of preventing deaths on the road. We must spend billions and billions of dollars every year as a nation on this issue. Yet cyberbullying is not really very frequently in discussion. And I think that reflects a few things about the political process, Deputy Speaker. One of them is that we know that this is an issue that prevalently affects young people, and in particular young people and children. And I just wonder if that is actually creating less focus on that than we would see if it was adults and voters, shall we say, who are affected by this problem. And I think it's just an important reminder to us as representatives that although the people who are affected by this problem aren't our voters, it's just as important that we listen to them, that we seek them out, and that we talk to them about problems that are affecting them. Because as I say, this problem is probably actually leading to more actual deaths in Australia than the road toll, and I think it should be getting some commensurate level of attention. The second thing I would just note is that, of course, it's a very difficult problem to stop. This is about people's behaviour in an environment where their behaviour is largely unregulated. But it is a problem that goes right to the heart of life in modern Australia. I know there's a lot of people that sit on this Labor side, particularly on our Labor front bench, who are parents of children who might be affected by this problem. And of course, Deputy Speaker, for that reason, we're very pleased to support the legislation. So I want to talk in a little bit more detail about what this bill actually proposes to do about this very difficult problem. There are two essential elements to the scheme that's being set up by this bill. The first is the establishment of a Children's E-Safety Commissioner. The role of the E-Safety Commissioner will be to crack down on online bullying. We know that a child who is the victim of online bullying will now be able to make a complaint, or their parent will be able to make a complaint to the Commissioner. The Commissioner will have the power to issue notices to social media organisations with which they must comply, and their materials will need to be taken down. A fine is imposed as part of the legislation, which will force social media companies to pay a certain amount of money every day that materials remain online after the Commissioner has required that they be taken down. The bill also sets out some expectations for social media organisations. Because, Deputy Speaker, I think it's very important that we acknowledge that social media organisations need to do better at preventing this problem. And I think we've heard in recent days, in fact, the CEO of Twitter has come out and talked about how that organisation accepts that it has a serious problem to deal with, and that it has a responsibility for criminal and bullying content that appears on its site. So I think we're starting to move towards being clear about what those obligations are, and the bill begins that discussion here. So what this bill requires is a certain set of minimum standards, and the service provider's terms and conditions of use need to reflect that. It requires social media sites to have a complaint scheme, very basic but very important, and also a dedicated contact person. So those who have tried to deal with some of these problems in the past will know that it's sometimes hard to find a person to talk to when you need to discuss these sorts of things. So these are important steps forward, Deputy Speaker, in what is a very difficult issue. I do need to point out, of course, that it does not solve this problem. There are a lot of things about online bullying that will not be prevented by this bill. One of the critical things, of course, is that the issue with social media and online bullying is that it's instantaneous. What we're doing here is setting up a commissioner. There'll have to be a process of review to look at content. This will have to go through back to the social media sites, and there'll be some discussion presumably there. So to the extent that young people are still going to be humiliated by things that happen online, this is not going to stop that conduct. Although I accept, of course, that there are additional consequences that are being put in place, and that's a very good thing. I think, just in closing, one of the things I would mention that we do need to think about and we do need to work on in this House is trying to help build resilience in young people and indeed in adults who use the internet. The internet is a part of life for us now, and it will just continue to be more and more integrated with the day-to-day activities of living as a human being and as a person living in Australia. So I would just say that we can put laws and regulations in place all we want, and we should always take action on an issue that is important as this one if we can. But I would note that something that all of us need to be doing is thinking about how we can ensure that young people have got the skills that they need to cope with what is a really very challenging, very difficult time, I think, to be a young person, facing into problems that as young people, those of us in this chamber never had to deal with. So I commend this bill to the House and thank you, Deputy Speaker, for the chance to make a contribution.
I thank the member for